So when was the first shots fired on Fort Sumter? All of you listening out there probably have a specific date and time in mind. And if you're a historian or a novice, you're probably correct in the literal term based on the information that you've been given. The federal government's website for Fort Sumter to this day would have you believe the first shots of the American Civil War took place at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, when the Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. But they are wrong. We're going to tell you why they're wrong here on this episode of Civil War Stories with Waffles. Now, we like to look at history in a past tense because it's in the past. We like to come to grips with everything based on that principle that we're learning history. And a lot of people like to look at these things from a point of view of something that could never happen today. Put yourself in this position. You're the President of the United States of America. A portion of your country has decided that they are going to separate themselves. Now, don't put yourself in the mindset of this reason or that reason. Why are they doing it? Why are they not doing it? Let's say it's happening right now, regardless of why anyone's doing anything. And you're the president. And that state has decided that it is going to separate itself completely from your government. It will not answer to you anymore. It will not answer to the rest of the states within that government. It is no longer wanting to be a part of this country. And you're trying diplomatically to do anything you can to stop them from doing this. And then that portion of the country decides it's going to pop shots at a portion of your forces, your military forces, that you've simply sent there, supposedly, to aid the forces that are down there on the coast. How would you react as the President of the United States? So keep that in your mind as we're going through this, because we're about to take our way through this podcast here and talk about Fort Sumter from its conception to the people that were in charge at the time. Then we're going to work our way into who was the actual president at the start of the American Civil War and what was his legacy. And eventually, we're going to talk about those actual first shots of the American Civil War, what happened, what took place, and what happened to the ship afterwards. And then we're going to ask some really, really personal questions about this. Primarily trying to get to the point of why. Why is it that we're taught one thing when there's a whole nother truth that's out there about this? Well, in order to get to the heart of everything, we need to kind of back up a little bit and get to the history of the fort itself. So the fort before the fire, Fort Sumter, it didn't just appear overnight. It was born from the ashes of the War of 1812, a war that revealed how vulnerable America's coastlines really were. In response, the federal government initiated a massive coastal defense project erecting a series of forts along the Atlantic Gulf coasts. Fort Sumter is located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, and it was one of those forts. Construction began in 1829, but it was never truly finished before the war broke out. Built on an artificial island, Fort Sumter stood as a symbol of federal authority in a state increasingly leaning towards rebellion. It could house 650 men and mount up to 135 guns, though in early 1861 it had fewer of both. When tensions over slavery and states' rights boiled over following Abraham Lincoln's election in November of 1860, however, South Carolina decided to secede from the Union just a month later. By then, Major Robert Anderson, a Union loyalist in command of Fort Moultrie nearby, and who was from slaveholding Kentucky, decided that he was going to make a bold move. He moves his men from that garrison at Fort Moultrie and quietly relocates to Fort Sumter on December 26 of 1860. It was a military maneuver with massive political implications. That move escalated an already delicate standoff, but the first shot of the war? That would not come aimed at Fort Sumter. That would be a lot earlier. So let's take a look at James Buchanan. He was really the lame duck in a storm. To understand how he got to those real first shots, we have to talk about him. History hasn't been kind to Buchanan, and with good reason. By the time he entered the presidency in 1857, the nation was already split wide open over slavery. His belief that the Constitution gave him no authority to interfere with slavery in the states, and so he didn't. Instead, Buchanan tried to appease both sides and ended up pleasing no one. He supported the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution in Kansas, and a decision that fractured his own Democratic Party. As the southern states began to secede following Lincoln's election, Buchanan clung to the notion that secession was illegal, but also believed that federal government had no power to stop it. So when South Carolina seceded in December of 1860, Buchanan did nothing. Worse, he tried to quietly resupply Fort Sumter without provoking a confrontation, an effort that would bring into the story a little-known ship that may have actually witnessed the Civil War's first real shots. So, let's talk about that ship. The ship's name was called the Star of the West, and it wasn't built for battle. It was launched in 1852, and she was a civilian steamship, a sidewheeler, used primarily for transporting passengers and cargo between New York and New Orleans. But in early January 1861, she became a tool for federal policy. Still under Buchanan's command, the War Department quietly chartered the Star of the West for a top-secret mission to deliver reinforcements and supplies to Major Anderson at Fort Sumter. The plan was covert. The ship, captained by John McGowan, would carry about 200 troops and needed supplies sailing under civilian guise to avoid detection and confrontation. And think about that, the ship was to resupply the fort, but it is carrying 200 soldiers on board. An insider decides that they are going to let this information into South Carolina. They're going to sneak this information in and let them know that there is a ship on the way carrying soldiers. She left New York Harbor on January 5, 1861, just 10 days after South Carolina's secession. Buchanan hoped to avoid any open provocation, but on January 9th, as the Star of the West entered Charleston Harbor under cover of early morning mist, Confederate-aligned cadets from the Citadel, actual military students opened fire from Morris Island. The shots missed, but the message was clear. This wasn't a drill. And I've even read some places that the ship might have actually been grazed or hit by one or two of those shots. The Star of the West turned back under heavy fire, retreating without ever reaching the fort. No one was killed, but historians have long debated the significance of this incident. Some argue that this, not Fort Sumter 3 months later, was the real opening act of the Civil War. And here's the kicker. It happened not under Abraham Lincoln, but James Buchanan. James Buchanan would still be the president for another 2.5, 3 months before Abraham Lincoln takes over. And we're always taught, Abraham Lincoln becomes the president, and the Confederacy fires upon the fort. And that's how war starts. He takes over a peaceful nation, and then there's war. Now let's talk about those first shots. What happened on January 9th of 1861 was no small skirmish. When Citadel cadets opened fire, they did so with the authorization from South Carolina's governor, Francis Pickens. It was an act of open rebellion, military force against the United States vessels. Although those forces in South Carolina may have not have known that that ship was a federal ship, because it was a civilian vessel after all. But this wasn't symbolic, it was an act of war. And Buchanan, once again, he did nothing. No retaliation, no aggression or aggressive response. Instead, he offered a diplomatic protest and continued to insist the federal government lacked the authority to coerce a state back into the Union. The failure to act emboldened the secessionist cause. It showed the South that the federal government under Buchanan was paralyzed. It was afraid to act decisively, even when fired upon. It gave secessionists at the time confidence and the space to organize a full-blown rebellion. Lincoln wouldn't be inaugurated for another 2 months, but the fuse had already been lit. The Star of the West didn't fade into history right away. After the failed resupply mission, she returned to civilian service briefly, but her time above water was short. In April of 1861, Confederate forces captured her in New Orleans. She was converted for use by the South as a transport and supply ship. Her service would end abruptly in 1863. Union forces scuttled her near Yazoo City, Mississippi, when she was used as river obstruction to prevent Union naval advances. The ship that had once carried troops for the Union was now debris in the war she inadvertently helped to ignite. James Buchanan is often remembered as the worst president in American history, and in many ways he earned that title. Faced with the greatest constitutional crisis the nation has ever seen up until that point, since the founding, he refused to act. His inaction allowed secession to gain momentum, permitted rebellion, and hardened into war. It left the incoming Lincoln administration with a crisis already spiraling out of control. The Star of the West incident, quietly brushed aside by official narratives, was a symptom of Buchanan's failure. It was a shot fired in anger, a declaration wrapped in gunpowder and smoke that Buchanan treated as a misunderstanding. And so, while the cannon at Fort Sumter may have opened the war officially, the real first shots, the ones that tested resolve, drew lines in the sand, and revealed the deadly seriousness of secession, came not in April, but in January of 1861. They came during Buchanan's watch, and history still hasn't held him fully accountable. So we come down to the part where I ask a very uncomfortable question here. Why Fort Sumter, and why not the firing on the Star of the West? Why do we teach that? Why does the U.S. government, historians, and most textbooks mark April 12, 1861, when Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter, as the official start of the American Civil War? Why not January 9, 1861? The day when Citadel cadets, young military students, still technically under the authority of the United States, opened fire on a U.S. merchant vessel in Charleston Harbor. The answer, like much of American history, has more to do with a narrative than with actual facts. Declaring that the Civil War started at Fort Sumter has political and symbolic utility. That's when the Confederate States, a formal and self-proclaimed separate government, used organized military force against a federal installation. It fits neatly into the story of a legal nation under attack by an illegitimate rebellion. It's a clean break. The line in the sand is clear. But the Star of the West complicates that narrative, because if we accept that the first shots were fired in January, then we have to grapple with something deeply uncomfortable. That the war didn't begin with a full Confederate military or even an official act of war by a foreign nation. It began with American military students acting with local government authority, opening fire on a federal ship, months before there was a Confederate army or a Confederate president. And if we teach that as the true beginning, it suggests something even more jarring. That the rebellion was already embedded within American institutions long before the Confederacy put on gray uniforms. It implies that secession wasn't just an external enemy rising up, it was a rot from within. Students trained by the federal government turned their guns on the same government. It wasn't a clear-cut invasion, it was disintegration. It was already here. There's also the uncomfortable truth about James Buchanan. If we teach the Star of the West as the real start, then we must also accept that Abraham Lincoln didn't inherit a country at peace. He inherited a war already begun by an administration that refused to name it, contain it, or even acknowledge it. And for a nation that venerates Lincoln as the great wartime president, there's a certain narrative comfort in placing the beginning of the war just after he took office. But truth doesn't always care about comfort. Recentering the Star of the West also forces us to ask hard questions about the nature of patriotism, loyalty, and institutional failures. What does it mean when the first shots weren't fired by a foreign enemy, but by our own children in uniform? By choosing Fort Sumter as the starting point, we simplify the complexity of how civil wars actually begin. But if we're brave enough to admit the real first shots came earlier, we might better understand just how fragile a republic can be, and how silently it begins to unravel. You see, that's the uncomfortable thing that we talk about in the whole story of the American Civil War. This country founded, like Abraham Lincoln said in his Gettysburg Address in 1863, 7 years ago, it was a nation that was short-lived at that time. And it was a principled on ideas of liberty, of union for that cause. And if we look at it from that full picture, and we're able to take ourselves above the narrative and realize that this story is extremely complicated. There's more to it than just good guy versus bad guy. There is more to this than what we're taught at grade school, and even what we're taught in college. You are the ones that have to decide and find this information for yourself, and hopefully learn something about this nation and yourself. Thanks for listening to the Civil War Stories with Waffles. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten history, subscribe and leave us a review. And next time someone tells you the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, tell them about the Star of the West. Until next time, stay curious.